Welcome everybody, kia ora koutou, and welcome to today's Thought Leadership webinar with the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee. So the title is A Recipe for a Thriving Region and Global City Maturity Cycles, presented by Kate Sutton, the Future of Auckland lead at Deloitte. Ko Frida Wells Tokuingawa, I'm the comms lead at the Leadership Committee. Bit of background, we're one of 6 such committees in Aotearoa. So the Leadership Committee is a mechanism for leaders in our region to collaborate on our shared challenges to positively shape our region's future. So today's topic, the 2024 State of the City report, examines how Auckland is tracking against 10 pillars of city performance. And Kate's going to talk about that. These webinars are just to platform the latest research, evidence and ideas to guide our decision making. We want to be able to tell future generations that we acted on the wisdom that we had at the time to support thriving communities in our region and beyond. A little bit about Kate. She works at the strategy team at Deloitte and specialises in developing and implementing new models and ways of doing things. And prior to Deloitte, Kate was the head of the Asia Pacific Regional Innovation Centre at the UNDP, responsible for innovation and digital strategy and policy. Prior to that, she worked at Nesta, UK's Innovation Foundation, and has developed cross-sector partnerships and models of delivery in local and central government across Europe. She's lived in and worked in Asia, Africa, and Europe, and is excited to bring her learning and global experience back to New Zealand. So I'm so excited to hear from you, Kate, and we're really lucky to have you beaming in from the Big Apple of New Zealand, Tamaki Makarau. So I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Great, that's wonderful. Thanks so much for the wonderful introduction. And I'm glad that people turned up, and for 2 reasons, that they didn't think, what's this Aucklander got to do with the rest of the country. That was really nice. But also it kind of shows me that there's a whole bunch of people really thinking about the situation and the time that we're in, and not just kind of retracting into themselves or ourselves, but actually thinking about what this next period looks like. And look, I'm going to show a slide deck, but I just really wanted to start by saying my first foray into local government, I was actually a local government representative. I was chair of a community board in Auckland a very long time ago when I was a young person. And I also worked for the Manukau City Council, for a trust that the Manukau City Council ran. And my experience of local government and its ability to be innovative and adaptive and really tailored to local needs has been nothing but kind of positive. And I think that the really exciting thing about this push towards devolution or whatever language you want to call, we can either look at it as a kind of cost and go, oh wow, local government needs to do a whole lot more things and we're not sure how to do that. Or we can either look at it, or we could look at it as an opportunity to go, right, this is the way that we're really going to drive localism. So, and I think in terms of politics, this is something where the left and the right can align is on localism. So we're definitely going to have an opportunity for conversation. I want to do that. So yes, please put thoughts in the chat as we go along. I will pause as I go along. I'm going to talk about the state of the city and a few learnings from that to start us off. But really keen to hear from you. I've kind of been pitted as a speaker and someone who has an expert, and I have some expertise to share, but you are all experts in something in some ways. So I'm really keen to hear from you as well. So I was saying I work for Deloitte. This is me. This is what I do. It was funny when I needed to write down what I do in the strategy team, and I thought, well, just new ways of doing things, anything. And that's kind of really what, when you look at my background, all sorts of primarily social impact, but all sorts of areas, and really thinking about the kind of methodologies, the intent, and the kind of systems for change, rather than necessarily being a deep expert in a specific area. But the last few years providing advice to governments in Asia Pacific on digital innovation strategy and policy. So that's a real passion of mine. Not much of a market in New Zealand, but we'll see what we can do over the next wee while with some of these reviews. So the key questions that I'm thinking about today is what makes a world-class city? We talk about this stuff a lot: livable cities, thriving cities. What are the characteristics and qualities of a city that can attract and retain talent? what can Wellington learn from our State of the City report, what we need to prioritise. And I think the thing that I'm going to go into, which hopefully isn't too nerdy for you all, is the kind of systems, models and structures that are needed, rather than just telling you the thing and you going, oh, that's nice, but it all feels too hard. So that's what we're going to get into today. And there's a piece in the State of the City report about comparing ourselves to our peers globally, which I think is really interesting, rather than just comparing ourselves to ourselves. So State of the City, Auckland is changing. This will feel really familiar for those of you from other cities. Demographic shifts, the census is really compelling. It's come out and said that half of Auckland is not Pākehā, which is really exciting. And massive change in demography, but also change in demography for the rest of the country. Obviously, our response to climate change. I mean, it feels, we had floods. Watching the pictures of what's happening in Dunedin over the last few days, my heart. This is just normal stuff now, and having to not just plan, but also make changes today. Housing affordability, economic dynamics. I mean, I think it's a bit on the nose to talk to people in Wellington about the economic dynamics, but I understand that things are really challenging in the city, and speaking to friends there, it's very hard when there are fewer jobs and when there's not that kind of, that leads to kind of low productivity. Ironically, it leads to high productivity in the sense that fewer people are doing the work, but over the long run, it's lower productivity, and that's really kind of hard for cities. What's happening in terms of infrastructure, that's extremely well canvassed. I don't think there's a day without infrastructure being in the news. And knowledge and innovation. So the challenge in Auckland, and I think that would probably be similar across the rest of the country, is our ability to take our kind of vast sort of natural resources, including our people resources, and turn them into kind of greater economic gains that can be distributed how we wish for them to be distributed. So what we did, so the Business of Cities is the global organisation that does the benchmarking, and Deloitte and Tataki Unlimited, which is our economic development agency, and the Committee for Auckland, which is a group of business and community leaders who are committed to the future of our city, came together and commissioned this work. So they have a sort of proprietary way that they compare. What's really cool about benchmarking is that you are looking, one can make progress. So people often talk about, Auckland's made this great progress in X, but then why are we so behind globally is because some of the other cities that we compare ourselves to have moved faster. So you can kind of, you can become really focused on, we need to catch up with Auckland if you're in Wellington. Well, that wouldn't be the way that I would view it. I'd be, what are the comparable cities globally who have those characteristics? So for Auckland, it's cities like Brisbane, Austin, Portland, Tel Aviv, Fukuoka. So there's some Asia Pacific cities, and there's some European cities, just to kind of do the comparison from, not the Sydneys or the Londons, because that's just too far away from where Auckland's at. So this is what it showed, our report this year. So we've done 2. We will be doing a 3rd one next year, and then hopefully continued it on. But looking at the areas where we are the weakest, so I said innovation and knowledge, and that's really about our ability to take educated people and generate kind of wealth activities. So whether that's business or industry, research and development, but also so it's not about, we actually have a relatively good education system in New Zealand comparatively. It's just our ability to kind of turn that into meaningful jobs for people. The opportunity and prosperity piece, which is the first one, which is reasonably weak too, is around the skewed metrics are around home ownership, primarily when you look at that cost of living. And we rate really well. Place and connectivity is an interesting one. So connectivity, we rate poorly when it comes to public transport, very bad compared to our peer cities. But some of our other connectivity, like digital, is actually quite good. When you think about what was kind of slightly controversial about the ratings was we did pretty well in sustainability. I know that when it came out in the press, people contacted me and said, no, we're doing appallingly. And I think that what it does say is 2 things. We've actually gone back in the intervening year around sustainability because of some of the policy settings. And I would expect to see next year's one showing us going back. But compared to those global cities, we actually do relatively well. We have very good air quality, extremely good kind of access to clean water. It doesn't necessarily feel that way when you're reading the press here, but and for the real lives of people who work in that space. But I think that comparative element will always make you look at, okay, perhaps we're doing pretty well there. Doesn't mean we need to stop our progress. And this is what that looks like in terms of comparing ourselves to our peers. And you can see that connectivity there. That's the public transport system. And prosperity and innovation. It's quite, I really like, the other thing about benchmarking is people can write off stuff when it's about comparing yourself to yourself. You can say, oh, Auckland was doing well before, but we haven't done so well over the last few years because we had a change of politicians and they didn't want to do that, or we weren't able to increase rates, or we're in a recession. And all of those things may be true. The interesting thing about this comparative piece is that people are quite motivated by being compared to their peers. There's an element of competitiveness that it's harder to explain away. So I think in terms of thinking about change architecture, so for those of you thinking about how do you encourage change, through this work, I've noticed a real, and particularly from the press, real desire to understand, well, what are those other cities doing that we're not doing? And certainly this government, so my engagement with ministers, a lot of people from this government are interested in what are we doing compared to other countries, other cities. So I'd really encourage you to think about that. So what does this have to do with Wellington? Now, I understand not all of you are from Wellington, but this is the people that have brought me here. Thank you to Wellington. So I want to talk about the cycle of cities, and I don't want to bamboozle you too much. And I can see that I haven't finished the top line here. This business of cities and X. Well, that's us. So business of cities and Bloomberg and some others have developed this model. It's still a model work in progress. They've done some academic articles, but I really liked it and I wanted to share it with you. So they call it the cycle of cities. I like to call it city maturity, and apologies for not having finished the slide before I presented it. It's a fail. Because when you're hearing the rhetoric around local government, it's often about kind of back to basics, doing the business of local government. That actually hasn't changed in the 20 years that I've been engaged in local government. That's a pretty normal thing. Sitting around a community board table with those who are like, what do we have to care about jobs and skills when we're in Tamaki, which is a low socioeconomic part of Auckland, and then others who are like, well, that's kind of a really important part of local government. I know the well-beings discussion and etc., but the role of local government, I know some of that has started, unfortunately, it's become politicized, it's become polarized. I think that's a real shame, because when you look at this starts to talk about what are the things that global, thriving, mature, whatever language you want, livable words that you want to use, what are the things that they have, the characteristics that they have, and starting to take it away from the core role of local government, rubbers, rats and roads and rates. Actually it's just not a thing anymore, because we know that for example, how talent is attracted and retained. People don't just want to, this is what I'm saying, people don't just want to live in a city that just has incredible roads or an incredible train system, but there's nothing going on. I mean, I lived in Bangkok, and the public transport system was amazing, but it was also extremely hectic, and there were lots of things that were broken about it, but it was an incredible place to live. So I think there is a question in those jurisdictions that I've shared, Fukuoka and Austin and Portland and Tel Aviv and Brisbane. There are different roles that local government plays. And I know that in New Zealand, local government actually does its role is actually quite small compared to, say, the United Kingdom, where I used to work and live, which had responsibility for schools and social care and all of that kind of stuff. But generally, they're comparable. And generally, these are the kind of things that I'd like to kind of depoliticize it, because to get to the fourth cycle, or to get to that end maturity point, there's some things in there which have become kind of polarized or politicized. And actually, when you look at those cities, many of them are run by Conservatives. The Brisbane Council has been run by Conservatives for a very long time. So we need to somehow pull those arguments apart. And I think these models can be helpful. So where I think we're at in terms of Auckland is between the second and third, and that's where a lot of the tension is, a lot of the drama, a lot of the tension. So you're seeing here, that kind of spatial, and so in Drury, the council are doing some work on having business and industry and housing together, that kind of maturity of looking at economic development in that way, that kind of international influence, looking at consumption patterns and economic growth and value. And I know many of the smaller city councils around New Zealand are looking at that, particularly spurred on by, I guess, hospitality businesses and local retail closing. That kind of the role of business and the role of universities and the role of other organisations. I would say Auckland, despite 15 years of the super city, is still trying to work that out. And I think that when you look at, I know that when you look at comparable cities globally, those relationships are more mature, and so that public-private collaboration beyond just financing is more normal. So I'm going to dig into this a little bit more, and then I'm going to pause. So let's dig in. And then I think it is the right time to pause. So I kind of was thinking, well, how is this useful for you? I think that there's a couple of things. So that what I've been saying in terms of it's useful in trying to normalize what's normal. So I think what happens around the local government table is people say it's a choice, it's a binary choice between, saving money, keeping rates as low as possible. We need to just do the basics. And obviously what the basics has changed significantly over the last 20 years in terms of the time that I've been following local government and working in local government, but also people's expectations. So now we've got citizen expectation, which is significantly different. We've also had significant immigration, so what people expect that the state provides and what happens in communities. And so I think in that, how can we take these sort of global norms and say it's normal for cities in the second to third cycle, which I would also say Wellington is in, to focus on public-private collaboration in a different way. It's normal for business to be in a different role rather than an advocacy group around a cycle whale, whatever, arguing, how does these, or moving beyond advisory groups. So we've sort of done this advisory group thing. I know people are sort of have done various forms of letting people from advisory groups vote and all of this, but I think getting that to look meaningful in a different way is really important, and that organising around the value of place. And I think that's we've got a signal from this government that they're willing to do that through the deal framework, and I think being able to look at innovative forms of partnership in that is going to be really key, rather than just funding for infrastructure and everyone getting grumpy with each other in a few years' time when people change their mind, which I worry will happen. So I'm going to pause, but I did want to say there's a lot of noise. And it's really hard to see this, and Frida and I were talking about this just before we joined with you all. It's really hard to get the signals at the moment through all of this noise. At a kind of personal level, which is, am I okay with my work? I noticed that, my organisation's going through 18 restructures. Will I be impacted by that? That's not Deloitte, by the way, but it's I've noted some of the people on the call where you're from, and what I feel like I've got the permission to do things differently, but in what area, I'm not sure. So that's that. It's very noisy, particularly in things like deals, funding and financing. If I sit through another webinar about funding and financing, I'm actually going to die, because it's not new news, so we need to kind of move into what do we actually mean, where is the money going to come from or not, who do we have in terms of financing. Again, around efficiency, most of the organisations on this call, you've done your first, second, third rounds of efficiency, so now we're starting to get into what does efficiency look like in this next phase. So before I get into the models I want to share with you, I'm just going to pause and see if there's any questions or commentary about the State of the City report. I realise I rattled through that. The State of the City report, what we learnt, but then also that city maturity, and I'm happy to go back to that model if you'd like to see that. Was there anything on the chat, Frida?
Thank you for that. We've got no questions yet. Just to let everyone know, your mics and your cameras are enabled. So please feel free to raise. Yes, we're all about agency. We're shifting to the. So feel free to raise a hand if you've got a question. It's always that first one that sort of there's more of the waiting. I was quite fascinated
really shy,
in that.
or they're just doing their Teams messaging while they're
they're ironing.
They're just doing their emails. They're ironing. That's what I do while I'm listening to webinars.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really valuable conversation that we need to have more of. I would be curious to go back to the cycles of the city, and I can throw the link to the report in the chat for people that would like to sort of have it open in front of them if they don't. Oh, we have a question. Awesome.
Nice.
Can you see that, Kate? Do you want to read it or do you want me to?
Can I? I should be able to. I can do two things at once.
No, sorry. Armin Gutska. So the question is, do other peer cities for Auckland use the same index for comparison of outcomes? If so, what is the index source?
Yes. So the answer is yes. So all of those cities that we compared ourselves to also use the same methodology, and some of them choose to compare themselves to us, but many of them don't. There are also another 100 and something cities in that data set. So Brisbane has a report, for example, they've actually made their last one very salesy, quite showy, trying to attract talent. They've got Australia's got a 1 million tech jobs campaign, and they've really kind of lent into that. Come to Brisbane. It's going to be great, and I really get that. So they use it for different reasons, but in general, people use it for the benchmarking. So about 100 cities, yes. So we compare ourselves against 9. They don't all compare themselves against us. Where is that data set? So if you go to the link that's been shared in terms of the report, there is some information on that data set in there, but there's about 200 data points. That is not public. That's not publicly available. Some of it is perception, and some of it is hard data. So things like it's not all perfect, but some of the things like prosperity, do you feel wealthier? Do you feel, some of those kind of feelings questions, and that can obviously be impacted by what's going on. The other one was safety. So there's real data around safety, but also feelings questions. And so just to let you know, one of the more controversial things that came through was in Auckland, people didn't feel safe. And the police were like, well, hold on, the statistics show that actually crime is pretty steady, or it's gone down. But the reality, until recently, where they've put more police around and things like that, there was a real feeling, particularly during that ram raid period, of people feeling unsafe. And it's actually quite a hard conversation to have, because on one level, I'm a data-driven person. I'm like, yes, I can see the real figures, but if people are feeling unsafe, that's a different metric to real lack of safety. So hopefully that answers the question.
It's fascinating, that qual-quant balance. Perception is
definitely
reality in some ways. There's a really cool question here. Melissa Davey has asked, are any cities in the 4th cycle and totally nailing it?
Oh, right. So yes, I think that if you look at kind of global livable cities that have these characteristics, those are the kind of usual suspects. So your kind of Barcelonas and your Londons and things like that. Now, obviously, when you get into those cities, you go, hold on. When I look at the news around those cities, I see tension. I see, kind of safety concerns. I see housing unaffordability. I see issues with over-tourism, over-consumption. Yes, but if you look at the functions of their city councils, their governments, and their state governments, if they have that, and the types of activities they do, their plans and structures, and how they view their cities, then you're at that kind of fourth cycle. So that fourth level of maturity. So global recognition, those permanent coalitions. So, I'll come back to London because I did a lot of work in London on these permanent coalitions, and it's basically just groups of people who have said we can work on these things for long term, and the relationship between the public and the private sector is more sophisticated. And I'm using that word. I'm a lefty, right? Like, I'm always going to be a little bit like, who's getting the benefit out of this? But what I did see in that was a different kind of conversation around, we need a working city, otherwise our staff will leave and we will not be able, if we don't have housing in the city, then we can't keep people here. So there were those kind of really dedicated, agenda-driven businesses who were like, we need to do this stuff. If the air quality is poor, people won't want to live here. If people can't get around, then we're going to have to pay them transport subsidies, or we're going to have to pay them more, or whatever. So there was a different kind of conversation. Whereas here, it does still feel really transactional, and it also feels really inflammatory. Like, I'm really unhappy about what you're doing about the bus stop. I mean, that is fine and really important because that's democracy, but the ability to have a different kind of conversation. And what I'm trying to do in Auckland, and I'll tell you in 6 months' time if it works, is contribute to this deal conversation with some of this stuff. But I don't know. I mean, I think that this is going to be multi-pronged and over a period of time. So happy to take any more discussion at this point. Otherwise, I'll kind of keep going because I've got more stuff and I'm going to run out of time.
Yeah, I know we've got some great questions pouring in. Do you want
yes.
sort of
or maybe we will.
more?
Maybe we will. I don't know. Let's see. So we've got, is Deloitte planning on doing other benchmarking in other cities? No. We'd love to do it. The cost is about 50 grand. Not that it doesn't go to Deloitte. It's a business of cities do. We just have facilitated all the production and stuff like that. So if people are interested, I'd love to connect you with Business of Cities. They're an amazing organisation. Tim who runs is an absolute legend. He was just in Stockholm talking about innovation, which is the next question. Why is Auckland so poor on innovation? As the biggest city, is it better or worse than the rest of the country? Okay, so I don't have the data on the rest of the country, but I do know about this. So in New Zealand, we have some structural issues around the connection between our educated population and our ability to create prosperous jobs. And by prosperous jobs, I mean high value jobs. So this really goes into all of the stuff around attracting foreign direct investment, waitlist exports. So this whole thing that government's on at the moment around productivity, it's effectively jobs where people are highly skilled and they get paid well. To kind of break it down, the economists in the room will be pulling their hair out, but that's effectively what it is. Structurally, New Zealand we do extremely poorly commercializing our outputs from our universities, our CRIs, and all of that kind of stuff, which is a shame because we've got a small country and people generally talk to each other. Some of it's because we're far away from, I guess, those markets, but some of it's cultural maturity. So in terms of Auckland, some of it's at that level. It's also our innovation. We just don't see innovation to be particularly important. I mean, council through our economic development agency does do innovation, but our economic development agency has been under attack for how many years since the last election? So I mean, I don't think. I think it's really hard for them to kind of stimulate that, and it's hard for people in local government at the moment to talk about the importance of jobs and skills and the connection to, startup enterprises and making sure that cities are agile enough to attract and retain people. It's not just about access to capital, but that's also part of it. So for Auckland, it's really detrimental if we see ourselves as a premier city. And we see ourselves as New Zealand's kind of biggest and probably most international city, and we would say that, then we need to really have those capabilities, because when you look at that cycle of cities, that knowledge, innovation, industry, so building clusters of industry beyond primary industries, having a more diversified economy is actually really important, and city planning and city strategy really can disable or enable that. I'm really nervous about our ability across our cities to see economic development beyond kind of infrastructure, or perhaps some kind of nice little committees or whatever. Like, it's a serious business, and I think I read through all of the economic development strategies, and good people like me put those together with good people like you, and they used to say tourism, and they all say this is what we can do. The reality is it's kind of like New Zealand New Zealand competing against the world. So we've got this whole thing. I know that there's definitely more regionalism. I know, like, for example, the Bay of Plenty are all working together. I know that the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee are working together, but there is a size and scale thing. And there's actually, when you look at the global statistics and the figures, that the size and scale of New Zealand is really competing against the world, rather than Auckland versus Wellington versus Christchurch, which is kind of the thing that happens. Now, to break that down is extremely difficult, and I do have some ideas about how we do that. But yeah, that's my thinking around that. Maybe I'll just try and rattle on. Is that okay? I just feel like I've got some great things.
I think that was an awesome...
And then you can share my slides after, and maybe we can have if people are really interested, I would love a virtual cup of tea with anyone who would love to have that, because I'm in my happy place right now. So
excellent. Yeah, loving it. Yeah, jump on in.
I mean, I'm assuming everyone's as excited as you, Frida. I can't. So I wanted to share a couple of frameworks with you. So for me, the kind of things around moving through the cycle of cities is obviously intent. And I actually think that that's really important. Like, we need to be intentional and say we want to be a different kind of city. Then obviously we tend to focus on structure. Oh, well, that means we need to amalgamate, or we need to devolve, or we need to have more local boards. Or the structure is just moving. I mean, yes, it can be very important in terms of a milestone to bring people together. And certainly for Auckland, the super city has just been, like, there are going to be people who say it's not. It has been wonderful. And I was reading my submission I made to the Royal Commission and then to the bill, which is over 15 years ago. And I was saying I'm really excited because I think the planning and all of this stuff has to happen at a regional level, but I'm nervous about communities' abilities to be able to do their own things. And I think that has broadly been what's happened. We haven't quite cracked the big small piece yet. How this stuff gets financed, how you measure impact, and the capabilities. So I do want to get onto capabilities. I'm so sorry that I'm going to rattle through this. So there's a whole lot of stuff here, and none of it is, well, some of it's my brain, but most of it's not my brain. But it's me working with amazing people globally. So I've been really thinking about how shit I've been feeling over the last few months, and how I came back from overseas and came to Deloitte, and they said, we want you to be in the Future of Auckland lead. We want you to bring all of these models and ideas from overseas. It's going to be great. And then it's been really hard. And people have been the people I've been talking to have been let go. All of the budgets have been reduced. People in strategic roles have been told that they need to focus on efficiency, but they're not necessarily sure what that means. And so I've been trying to take a step back and think about what is the year 0 to kind of year 10 look like for me and personally, and for this role at Deloitte, if they'll have me for that long, but also for you all. So I think that kind of building the foundations and that place-based system of working. The Wellington Regional Leadership Committee's been building that in terms of your structures over a period of time. And I really like this model because it helps to remind us of the way that change happens, and there's also a maturity in there as well. So I think taking some time to deep dive into that, and also think about how that kind of existing relationships, existing assets, existing root causes. So those systems practitioners in the webinar will get that. And just that learning, we really struggle to be learning organisations in New Zealand. That's definitely something I've noticed coming from Europe back to New Zealand. We don't, I know that some organisations do, but we do really struggle to kind of learn. We definitely have a bias towards action as a Pākehā population. That kind of is a very Calvinist former, we hard work. Let's just start doing things, let's dig a hole. And then everything slows down and everyone gets grumpy because we didn't think before we started digging the hole. Now that's probably a poor analogy for what's happening right now, but I think thinking and talking are important, and bringing people together and looking at what their different capabilities are is really important. And I'm not sure we do that in a thoughtful enough way, that kind of mutuality and capability sharing. You'll know the Overton window, but I really wanted to raise it with you right now, particularly those of you who are feeling quite frustrated. So it's changed, the Overton window shifted in the time. So I said, I feel shit because the window's shifted. And so what change am I able to make within my organisation? For those of you who don't know this, it's quite a helpful way of thinking about sort of what policies and is tolerated. So I'm going to talk about cycleways. Let's build some cycleways. John Key, it's the future. Let's do cycleways. Now cycleways is like a trigger for everything, for wokeness, which I don't really understand. I mean, we know that sort of those global forces around Trumpism and all that kind of stuff have made us more polarized. COVID's made us more polarized. So we need to think about change and what we're doing in a different context to what we did pre-COVID. And so that requires those of us who are practitioners of new ways of doing things. I'm not necessarily say progressive, even if you're in a conservative ways of doing things, that we need to think about where this window is at. A couple of really cool collaboration models that I've used. So thinking about the spectrum, this is from the Partnering Initiative in the UK. They're awesome. They do a lot. I've been trained by them on kind of partnering. So that kind of value exchange, transactional exchange, integration and systems change. I don't think that people can go straight to systems. I don't think people can go straight to radical collaboration. It's kind of like saying we're going to get married. It's kind of like married at first sight. I'm going to open the door and we're going to get married. I mean, I don't know if you guys have been following that, but that's chaos. I mean, most people start by looking at each other on Bumble and working out if you want to collaborate, and then meeting and going out and seeing if you like each other. So I think that and there is a lot of analogous there. What are my motivations? Am I ready to get married, and you're not? Like, what are the things that we share, and what are the things that we don't share? And I think thinking about partnership in that way is very helpful. And the other one is the collective impact, which I've run a couple of collective impact things. Which is where organisations really commit to funding together and going forward together. I think most people in New Zealand, most organisations in New Zealand are used to kind of joint programs of work. So we're kind of going to come together. We're going to have a committee or some kind of governance oversight. We're going to work on 2 or 3 projects together. We've probably got some metrics of success, but we haven't really done an assessment of what assets I have, what assets you have, what are we really trying to achieve. I think in New Zealand, it is hard. We don't often want to say what we really want to achieve. And I would encourage all private sector organisations to be really transparent. Yeah, I really want my industry, my business to stay in Wellington. I need to make a certain amount of money to do that. I want to, I think we find it hard to talk about some of those real truths. And I think that's going to help us shift if we can have those kind of more meaningful conversations. And that doesn't mean longer conversations, it just means clearer conversations. This is Nesta, thinking about new operating models for local government. They've tested this and trialled this in the UK, and really thinking about the kind of capabilities for thriving people in place. So the things that I want to pull out for you is on the being side. So collaborating across the systems, do with, do not. Some of that will make sense. And that kind of community wealth building, thinking, which I think really works nicely with devolution, which is like, how do we build wealth in Wellington? So how do we keep critical industries, but also how do we, if we're going to sell some assets, could the community buy them? Could they buy shares in it? Could we, so I mean, creating real wealth. So wealth at a real level, so money, but wealth at a community kind of resilience or perspective. And I think shifting some of the thinking rather than we have to sell our assets and they have to go offshore so that we can have money to pay for some roads locally. There's kind of a different way that we can do things, and certainly at Nesta they were able to trial that in real time. And then I've got three more things. Current thinking around capabilities, state capabilities. This is from Mariana Mazzucato. I've worked with her in Europe through with Nesta. So what are the capabilities that we need within local and central government? So sensing, orchestrating, seizing. So that's like, what's going on? What do we need for the next 5 years? How do we bring people together? And then the seizing and the shaping is the model. And then the diffusing is making it normal. So getting out of that, it's a project or it's a pilot or it's a prototype. And then making sure that those kind of routines are there, but also recognizing the legislation and that's required. So pushing through from projects to legislation and seeing across, and you need civil servants, officers that with the capabilities in those different spaces. And then there's also a states of change one, which might be quite helpful, which is Nesta as well. But I'll send it all to you, Frida, and you can send it out to the team. A lot there, but I think my key points are around thinking about that maturity and using that maturity model to kind of have different kinds of conversations. If you're not a city leader, I think you could still have that within organizations. So what is, rather than what does a good look, what's happening with funding and financing here? We want to, that kind of vision piece is really important, but they're coming back to kind of models and modalities for doing that, and then the capabilities that are required to get there. Now,
thank you.
Oh my God, this could have been all day.
Oh, right. I mean, I was thinking I'm going to get you to start a course and I'm going to sign up for it. So
it would require me being able to spell on my PowerPoints. But anyway, yes, thank you.
Being overdoing, yeah. So everyone, please use this time with Kate. It's quite an amazing opportunity to jump into Q&A, and I just encourage you to switch on your cameras, raise a hand if you've got a question. I've certainly got a few, so I'm happy to kick off. I sort of wanted to ask you, Kate, that whole idea of, we're quite transactional in New Zealand, and yes, that concept of collective impact sounded, in terms of having more sophisticated, when you're talking about Auckland having like real structural issues around translating great education into sort of high value jobs.
Yep.
Do you think there's an issue around trust, intra and inter organizational?
Yes, definitely. So one of the things, and I've been thinking about this a lot, so there's definitely a challenge when you're working in an environment where there's less money. And I really want to acknowledge that. So I've mentioned Nesta a couple of times on this call. Nesta is an endowed foundation where money from dormant assets, which is bank accounts where people had died and not claimed them, was given to an organisation to experiment and make the UK an innovative place, right? In New Zealand, we don't have much of that layer. We've got some amazing philanthropy, but that layer is not. It's not. I know J.R. Mackenzie and Foundation North and some of the others do kind of enable some of this, but it's really hard. So the other thing is, I think that there is a scarcity mindset because of that. If I do this work, there's not a pie to grow. We've only got 100 grand to do this thing. What are we going to choose to do? So I do really want to acknowledge that. I think that there are a lot of good, and I think that there's another thing around the public service. So in the public service legislation 2020, it talks about systems, and there were systems leaders, and there was lots of systems mapping done. I think it got kind of like over academic. It got made too academic and didn't actually flow through to, I think, the intent of the Act, because when you look at global public sector capability, They also have similar intents, and so I think that's the same with, I think local government's able to be more agile there. They have less prescription, but they also have fewer people. So some of it is definitely cultural, but in saying that, it's very easy to access people. We're very friendly. I think it just takes longer to be convinced of things, and there's often a nervousness that someone's going to take money from me, or I'm not, and I really get that right now. Although my feeling of about right now is like, we need to think about this next phase, and by next phase I mean like the next 3 to 5 years. There's actually probably not that, if you perceive that we're in a crisis, there's probably less to lose, so there's more willingness to work together.
100%. I am sensing that it's
Don't
sort of
waste
like
a
now
crisis.
there's nothing to lose. Yeah, this might just catalyze some wonderful collective impact partnerships.
Yes.
Where we discover we do have that shared vision, which kind of feeds into Armin, which kind of ties into the idea of the vision maybe. The report provides a current state view and trend line. Is there an intent to feed this into future modelling to preempt or achieve the desired outcomes?
So no, I think I get where you're coming from, which is how can we... So I think that there are issues with the data and sense of that its current state and looking back. I mean, I think we have definitely talked about this in terms of like the predictive capability of going forward. I mean, ideally what you'd want to do is you'd want to get a data set like that and go, okay, if we were going to move the dial of something, would that be the right thing to do? You know, where do we really want to, there's 10 factors here. If you were really trying to be a wealthy city, or if you're really trying to be an eco city, if you're really trying to be an international attractive city, what would be the things that you would dial up? I don't think the sophistication's there. But in saying that, I would imagine that that's, you know, presently, right, the state of how quickly this predictive capability is moving. Yeah, I would say that that's something that's probably not too far away.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question anyway?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious about your view of Auckland amalgamation. You did say that it was overall a good thing.
I'm reformed.
Sort of... Okay, right. I have worked at Auckland Council, and yeah, for all its flaws, I think it does a pretty good job, mainly because it integrates across all of the kind of land area that was previously kind of little sort of kingdoms, really, that didn't collaborate. So and yeah, so I think it does pretty well. Obviously, Wellington's got a bit of a challenge in that area, but do you have any ideas about how that could be sort of brought on a little bit more?
So I think that, you know, what was really interesting, and we're actually going to do a bit of a retrospective and then a looking forward next year, because it'll be Auckland at 15. And I know, you know, if you think about it, was the Clark government that brought in the Royal Commission, and then the Key government and Hyde who brought in the final changes. The Royal Commission was because it wasn't working. You know, planning, it was really about planning and infrastructure and that kind of scale of a city of 1 million people or plus, right? And I think that, has it solved that? Yes, like their ability to buy more sophisticated products and services, the ability to attract and retain people that are at, you know, really, you know, extremely high quality people, their ability to action things is significantly changed, and the spatial planning is really advanced. It's still more to be done, but it's really good. The nervousness was always around the localism. So what's that going to mean for local voice, and would local boards really be empowered? And in a way, now we actually have lots and lots of local government politicians, and you some of the arguments are still the same. I think the efficiency, and there's been challenges, obviously. The new mayor came in and said there's not enough efficiencies, and the CCOs, look, that was definitely you know, the private sector can do it better. Let's hand these functions off, and it looks like some of those functions are going to come back in. I don't think that structural reform changes some of the things about local government. You know, the very senior governors are still dealing with community graffiti. You know, the whole thinking was, oh, they'll sit up at this high level and they'll deal with these high level things. Yes, but the community also expect them to deal with graffiti. And if you know anything about local politics, is you get voted on those things, right? Like, these are cutting the ribbon on the swimming pool and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think it solves all of that, but I do think it gets to the scale point. And I definitely feel like this is probably where it is to head. So I'm reformed. And the ability for the local boards to be able to make real decisions. Community boards, we were not empowered. We gave a lot of advice, we said a lot of things, but we were not empowered. So I think it's been really powerful. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. And so I'll be interested in this retrospective and this looking forward to see if we can think about what's needed. Definitely what's needed is we need to get out of our own way. So previously in the talk, I talked about, New Zealand competing, and I don't really like that, but language, against the world. There's so much, we really look inwards and we look down. And it's very hard for a big organisation like Auckland Council to look out. But the next phase for us in terms of maturity is looking out and going, what are the things that we want to be famous for and how we're going to make that happen?
A great answer. Thank you. Brian Patchett's got your hand up.
Brian Patchett, I work for Kāinga Ora in the urban development part of Kāinga Ora.
Oh, great. What a great part of the organisation.
So, Kate, thank you for a really interesting presentation. I guess my question is one about our blind spots in this discussion. So when I look at that set of comparator cities, it's notable to me that there's no Phoenix or Tucson or Houston so those big south and southwestern cities in the US that have a completely different model of urban development. They have very affordable housing, they have dynamic economies, and they're kind of unfashionable for us in us as urban development professionals. I'm just wondering what you think we can learn from those cities, if anything, particularly given the government's interest in competitive urban land markets, which is sort of an idea out of those locations.
It is. Yes, and we understand that the Minister for Housing has had some advice out of that. So I think in terms of our choice of cities, there was a couple of, probably three things to think about. The first one was what data was available, and there was more than 100, so that was good. What was comparable, and so there was definitely a bias towards population, some demography, some land form, which might give you an indication into why some of those other cities weren't chosen. Some of the critical infrastructures, your port city kind of thing. And then we went for a bias, you could say, oh, we'll just do all Europe, right? And that wasn't going to work. So some Americas and some Asia Pac. So the first step is it moves the conversation away from us comparing ourselves to Singapore, London, Sydney, which is just not helpful. It's helpful in some ways. Cool. I've talked about London. We can learn some models, but it's not helpful when you're aggregating lots of data points thing. In terms of, so that was why the State of the City was designed the way that it's designed. Is that perfect? No. Could we have chosen a whole lot of different cities and we would look differently? So we could choose some different cities, like perhaps some of the ones that you've described, and our public transport system would look really, really good. So there's definitely a kind of element of that. In terms of our blind spots, yes, I think that there's definitely we definitely have blind spots towards Asia, way more than we have blind spots towards America. I mean, it's astonishing to me. Sometimes it feels like people still think Asia is like what it was 30 years ago or whatever, and Asia's a blob. Having worked there, I would say most of the governments are sophisticated, if not more sophisticated than ours. So, I mean, I think that there's an element of comparability and making the right choices around comparability. Where it's hard in America and also in Australia is the kind of state and federal system and how different and diverse they are. And I guess some of the political characteristics. I think that as systems change practitioners, we lose, if that's what we want to call ourselves, or as change people or as people who want to make things better, you can't have those blind spots and you need to be open. And you also need to be open that there's many different ways to get to the outcome. So a lot of the time the argument is stuck on structure because people are so fixated on that structure, and there's actually different ways to get to the outcome that we're trying to get to. I see an openness and a willingness from this new government to look at that, which I think is a positive thing. What we need to do now is, I guess, push towards real diversity of discussion rather than just we want to have a discussion, but we're only going to talk about X. Yeah. And so I work in localism in Wellington. My key barrier, and Wairarapa, wonderful, what a wonderful part of the country. My key barrier is around building local capacity, and want to have examples. Yeah, so I think one of our next big challenges is really about capacity and capability building, and people talk about this a lot, but we invest very little in it. So our professional development budgets are very small compared to global peers in terms of OECD metrics, and then our willingness to spend any money in a project on capability and capacity building is extremely low. And we have a bias towards the thing, right? The Excel spreadsheet, the report, the hard hat, the whatever you want to call it. So going back to my European, but also when I was working in Thailand, a really strong, they're Buddhists, so they have quite a different way of looking at projects. And that kind of the legacy of the project was often the capacity and capability rather than the thing itself, which felt like such a radical shift for me coming from New Zealand. So some of the stuff, the local government project I think actually is the best ever is the Mayor's Task Force for Jobs. I don't know if it's a thing. I looked it up and it seems to have not be such a thing, but certainly in the early to mid 2000s, it's a really big deal. And that it took real localism and said, we're going to do this. We've got some clear targets. We've got something that we can activate the private sector around. The mayors can get out there and go, this is something that I want for my community. And there was a lot of capability built at that time in pockets. And I think it's a real shame, but then it got caught up in the whole, what is the point of local government? It shouldn't be anything to do with jobs, and some of the key cities pulled out and all of that kind of stuff. I think the environmental movements, when you look at things like Tataki project and some of those water restoration, stormwater restoration, resilience organisations are pretty good at capability building. It starts from a kind of health and safety perspective, but then it often moves into like a local knowledge perspective. There's a kind of, I think sustainability and nature people tend to have a bit of that vibe anyway. But I feel like having, and that's why I shared some of those models, and hopefully that will spark something for you, having a model around it rather than saying we're going to build capability. So there's a question around what capabilities do we want to build? Are those like hard or soft? They could be the capability to work together. How will we measure that? It could be the capability to move people up the chain of from being a volunteer to that's the normal one, volunteer to being more committed or paid or whatever. So I think some of those I think learning from some of those other sectors, but also putting in place a really clear model of capability change is really key. And I think there's also an element of valuing the interrelational capability, and I don't mean getting on. So I don't mean me and Frida like each other. I mean, can we work together on something? And we don't know that yet because we haven't been in a business partnership or a project relationship together. So we would need to put things in place to build that capability. I think we're usually quite focused on relationalness. Oh, I know Frida, she's a good sort. We'll work together. It's easy. Whereas we probably skip straight to that and don't do the what are your motivations? What are mine? Where are we? What are my capabilities? What are yours? Are they really my capabilities? What else do we need to bring in? That kind of thing.
It's so interesting. Yeah, that sort of we just assume we're humans, we can get along, but maybe we need to formalize that a little bit with even a strengths finder or leaning into those conversations that might feel a bit awkward, but pay off in the long run when it gets. Yeah, that's fascinating.
But what was your question, Kate?
Yeah, I'm curious in terms of a lot of what you've said has resonated with me in terms of I've worked in local government and central government, and you can sometimes feel like you hit a ceiling in terms of the authorising environment or the decision makers. Have you got examples where you've been able to bring the mindset of a leader along the maturity cycle a little bit to kind of win them over or convince them that it's worth trying things a bit more?
So, and I do feel apologetic that I've spent the last decade overseas because not a lot of my examples are local. I think there are many boroughs in London, Camden's a really good example where they decided. So it's really interesting how crisis has led to a lot of change. So what's happened in the United Kingdom was they were going bankrupt, and the government would let them go bankrupt, whereas I don't think that would happen here. I don't know. We'll see. And so through that crisis, there was a choice. We either cut, and just have like Bob collecting the rubbish, or we do something differently. We do like a wealth building approach, or we look at valuing land in a different way, or we look at building apartments over the top of our libraries with local community development organisations, or we look at whatever. And I think that drove that crisis drove a lot of innovation. And so then it was a leadership imperative. It wasn't like, oh, I've got to a really thoughtful, it's really funny here, like I've got a thoughtful staff member who wants to try something different. It's like it's twee. So it's kind of how to connect it with the business imperative. I think with some of the conversations where I'm having professionally with Auckland Council, it's definitely there. Like there's a kind of, okay, so innovate to move forward. If we seriously want to achieve some of these foreign direct investment targets, it's actually going to require different looking cities. So like there's a kind of government business imperative as well. And people might not like that, but that's just the reality of it. You don't invest in a place where it's just crummy, or you don't see a future for yourself there, or you know there's nothing to do on the weekend. All the shops close at 8 o'clock or whatever. So I definitely think kind of connecting it to those business imperatives. Also, usually within organisations, there is a couple of leaders who have these kind of this ability and willingness to kind of experiment, I guess. I think it's about getting the balance right. I'll always talk about sort of 20% innovation or 10% innovation, because BAU can only get you so far. It's whether you want to frame it as innovation. I'll often frame it as new ways to get there, because innovation feels like kind of wonky and you're wearing sneakers. The other one is like making it a thing, that making it sexy and cool. So with a lot of the European, and also across America, like the Bloomberg City Data Alliance and the kind of Bloomberg mayors, it's all very cool. So there's like elitism to it, right? So like, working out what the execs and the CEO, maybe more likely to be the execs, are motivated by. And if it's usually, some kind of power or ego, or, being seen as a thought leader or whatever, and making it easy, I guess those are really important things. My suspicion is that this next phase will be driven by crisis, rather than, so my colleague, our friend from Kaiangora was just speaking before, that organisation's going through massive change. There'll be cuts, then they'll have to deliver some different stuff, and then they'll go, oh shit, we need to look at this differently, because, and I'm sure they are already, but like it starts to become more of a part of the business model rather than a nice to do thing on the side, I guess. And then often the other one is the politicians. I would say in Auckland Council, some of the politicians are really sick of having the same conversation. We don't have enough money. We can't do any more things. That's pretty lame, and it's not a really good thing to go into an election with. Yeah.
Thank you. There's nearly something comforting in that idea that crisis brings around innovation, because you think about some of these cities that we love to celebrate in the media, like Copenhagen cycleways and Holland and Carla streets and dense apartments or medium density. And it's like, maybe that was less of a choice and more of a we're forced to, we've run out of,
Yes,
so in
run
some
out of
ways.
Space. And taxation.
Yeah,
and those other levers, yeah, totally.
Levers.
In terms of housing, there's so many amazing urban development people who have worked so hard on getting the zoning changed and let's go up and all this, but also the economics of living in smaller houses has driven us to that as well. It's been both.
Yeah. And we've got another question from Chris. Hi, Kate. Do you have any thoughts on New Zealand Council planning's separation of people who came to cities to be together since the mid-20th century?
What do we mean, Chris?
Yeah, can you be more specific?
Yeah, well, basically the planning over the last few generations has been all about separating people into, suburbia away from the city area.
Oh, right.
And in Auckland, of course, it's an extreme example. And they have also separated the city into, polycentric city. And that has caused dislocation, and people can't so easily have conversations or teach or learn or work together or anything like that, or socialise together. And it also separates people who could otherwise, collaborate together in business. And that seems to have a disruptive effect.
I understand. I understand what you're saying.
And also I'd add to that it creates, multi-billion-dollar costs of transport, both public and private transport, motorways, and the various infrastructure. And if
no, totally. Like if you're a radical policy maker, you would change. It's school holidays at the moment, and if I drive through Auckland, we don't need any more roads, team. It's done. It's done. If we had different patterns of work and different patterns of school. But anyway, that feels like far too radical. So I think urban planning is not my specialty, but urban planning obviously comes into this, right? So from the selection of cities for our report, which was brought up before, And it's really interesting because some of that stuff in that cycle of cities, it's been pointed out to me, it's quite progressive, like is there a value bias or a political bias over this? In the committee for Auckland, I would actually say the committee for Auckland bias is probably more towards conservatism, but we're an organisation of people who are advocating for these things, which some of them could be perceived as probably more progressive. So the first thing is that a lot of the city planning stuff in New Zealand, for whatever reason, has become conservative or progressive, and it's not in other cities. Like Frida and I were just talking before the call, like in the UK, net zero is the right and the left, yes, they both agree, like it's a thing, and they both agree to spend tons of money on it. So there are places in the world, I think our idea of what is in and what is out is not necessarily the truth compared to the rest of the world. And I think if you look at innovation theory, so one of the questions before around innovation, and you come really hard down into it, a lot of it is about co-location and clashing, people coming together and ideas being shared and that kind of dynamic city stuff. So what's happened in cities like Auckland is we've gone, well, we're going to have co-working spaces, we're going to have innovation hubs, so we're going to artificially bring people together where we don't have those kind of old, the local town hall stuff anymore. I think the bigger issues around that you're talking about is kind of, also the other thing is how do we really extract the dividend, if you want to see it that brutally, from our ethnic diversity. So for Auckland, I think we've talked about this a lot for a long time. It's great, we're the most Pacific city, and how do we really make the most out of that? I think the economic imperative is now actually real because of the size and scale of the population. So I said half of Auckland's not white. I think it's, 1/3 of young people under 25 identify as Māori. These demographic shifts are now business imperative shifts. So hopefully you'll also see in local government and central government the conversation shifting from sort of like either equity arguments or we must consider diversity to these are imperatives. I know that this Community Housing Foundation and some of the others are advocating for like inclusionary zoning. Those are the kinds of mechanisms that have been used globally, and certainly some of the cities that we've benchmarked ourselves against use inclusionary zoning, which does change the way. I just haven't seen any appetite for it. I know it was part of the conversation in 2005, 6, 7, but I don't think there's been any real conversation about it since.
Thank you. We've sort of got 3 minutes left, so we've really got time for probably one more, even a half-formed one. Chances are other people are thinking the same thing. I'm just going to fill the silence. I have a lot of questions for you, Kate. And again, I will send out Kate's slides to everybody along with her LinkedIn and her email, so you can jump on for a coffee. So I being quite fascinated with what you said around that reluctance to invest in the capability and capacity and just focus on doing the thing. I have absolutely experienced that, driven by the Gantt chart, the spreadsheet. I'm curious if you could maybe specify some things that make an organisation a learning organisation.
Yes. I mean, the biggest organisation that I've been part of that's been trying to become a learning organisation is the UNDP, which is a beast. Tens of thousands of staff across 180 countries, if there are 180 countries. What did that look like? At some levels, extremely relational, and at other levels, really automated. So there was a big shift towards taking all of the data that we have and trying to understand what's really going on. So I would say that in my experience here, there's a lot of reckons, a lot of like, oh, this is how I feel. And like a local government, that's a thing. This is how I feel. I talked before about safety. This is how I feel. So I definitely feel like a lot of using the data that we had to try and understand what was going on and sharing that and trying to make it a deliberate part of any kind of new project and program management. And then a lot of webinars, a lot of discussions, a lot of weight and emphasis put on the importance of learning. So that was also the same at Nesta. Like culturally, it was the first time in my life that being smart was a positive thing. Like me being a smart person was something I could say, and it wasn't an arrogant thing to say. Whereas I feel like saying you're smart here or you're intelligent or whatever is like really frowned upon. So I think it's hard for people to have conversations where you're trying to pull it apart. So rather than it being personal, so like I'm trying to build on top of you, oh, you shared that framework, it doesn't really work for me, I'm trying to build on that, let's explore that together. So I think it's that kind of curiosity and kind of that it's a shift in mindset towards and saying that we're going to be a learning organization. Now, learning organization can just be learning from failure. So it was quite trendy for a while to do kind of like fail fests and F up webinars, and when the project went bad. And actually in the project management community, that's quite normal. Like, what are the things that we did where we really like that kind of diagnostic? You can take it in less of a airy fairy kind of feelings way, and you can take it down a more diagnostic route. So like, what are the things that we know now that we didn't know before, and what are the things that we can take into the next project? And I think with the access to data and the ease of that data, you don't need to be an expert to read data now if you're using the right tools. That starts to change your ability to sense. So that was those dynamic capabilities, your ability to sense what's really going on, sees what's going to be able to work now, and then make those changes, rather than, oh, look, that's a kind of rather than learning for learning's sake. Because I think people go, oh, I don't really want to invest in Kate because she's going to be gone in 2 years, or she might get really smart and then get a better job, or, I get that there's a game of chicken that goes on about it, but I think if the organization is learning rather than the person, that can sort of shift that power dynamic. Yeah.
Lots of gold there, and
Yay.
that's very motivating for me. So we've hit time, and that was just brilliant. Huge thank you, Kate. Clearly, you're going to be my go-to person for all my big questions going forward.
So I got to, what I didn't get to talk about was I've sort of run some I ran a partnership in the UK, which was a whole lot of private sector organisations coming together to drive 50,000 more jobs in the West Midlands. I mean, to do that and to get to the 50,000 jobs, it does take time, but it's a coalition of the willing thing rather than a who's supposed to be here or whatever. It was like, who are and I think right now coalition of the willing is really important, because not everybody's going to be able to engage because of various reasons. So that would be my other thing in terms of getting to that maturity, is what's the willingness. But I'll share the slides with you and you can send out, and there's a couple of other frameworks that might be helpful for people too on there.
That's a wonderful point to leave it on, finding sort of go where the energy is, and the coalition of the willing is a real thing. It doesn't matter where they are in the organisation, the hierarchy, the discipline, it's that collectivizing. Yes. Amazing. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us. That was a really inspiring conversation.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to hearing from some of you on LinkedIn, and please feel free to email me and we can catch up. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot under all of that. So thanks for just taking the whistle stop tour with me and Frida. And solidarity with the crew in Wellington. Hard times. But, we can't just, one city can't just be successful. We all have to, as I said, it's, New Zealand needs to come together. So, yeah, looking forward to being part of that with you.
Amazing. Huge thank you.
Cool.
Ka kite.
Right. Thank you. See ya.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.